unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Stephen Nadler, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin. Also, the author of a number of books, co-author, most recently, of this book, When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People, How Philosophy Can Save Us from Ourselves. And then a bunch of books on early modern philosophers, including this one, Think Least of Death, Spinoza, on how to live and how to die. Another book on Spinoza called A Book Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age. And then this one, The Best of All Possible Worlds, on Leibniz and Arnaud and Malebranche. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I thought we get started by taking a look at this book here, When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People, because it is sort of you're trying to encourage people to become more philosophical, right? To live the examined life. I mean, you're trying to do what philosophers have been trying to do since we've had philosophers, which is to get people to do more philosophy. And I guess, you know, when you make this recommendation, do you think that our times are maybe more in need of philosophy than other times, or is this some kind of book that could have been written at any point in our intellectual history?
I don't think there's anything unique about our times in terms of irrationality. This book not only could have been written centuries ago, but has been written centuries ago. I mean, you could think that every dialogue by Plato or Spinoza's Ethics or Descartes' Meditations or Hume's treatise or Kant and so on are all in a way briefs on behalf of the philosophical life and philosophical living. And then think about the Stoics. Philosophy is promoted as a way of life and not just an abstract academic exercise. So in that sense, it's just another book on what philosophers have been trying to do for many, many eons. And irrationality has been around just as long as human beings have. There were conspiracy theories in the ancient world, and there are conspiracy theories today. And I don't think that human beings are necessarily more or less irrational now than they were centuries ago. However, the difference is that irrationality can flourish more easily now with the advent of social media, internet sites that traffic in irrational beliefs, that encourage irrational thinking, and that make it very easy for a person to be overwhelmed by misinformation and thus form beliefs without any evidence and never really be exposed to counter evidence. So I think we are in an especially dangerous period in terms of the spread of irrational beliefs and the siloization, and this is a good podcast to talk about siloization of information, where individuals tend to get their information from a very narrow range of sources, and those sources now are becoming even more disparate and more cut off from other sources that might offer a more balanced picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody thinks that they live in, a particularly irrational age. But historically, I mean, it is hard. I mean, it would be wonderful if we had sort of a rationometer, right? That we could kind of go back and look at things. Maybe our lens is somewhat distorted because we don't really have a good sense of what ordinary people thought. I mean, we live in a world where the number of people who are college educated is much greater than we had in the past. And so I guess for us, it's particularly surprising that we have so much irrationality or bad thinking, given that we have so much more education than we've had in the past. I mean, do is that what makes it particularly disturbing, right, to us in the 21st century? The fact that, there is so much education and yet there's still so much bad thinking?
I guess I'm not that surprised. Just because you have a higher degree and you're well educated doesn't mean you're going to avoid irrationality or bad thinking. It depends, of course, on what you studied. Just because you went to college, um, it depends upon what you're exposed to. I think people who generally have an education in the liberal arts, who have taken courses in philosophy, history, literature, art history, and so on, have probably been exposed to good lessons in critical thinking, how to read, how to assess the validity of sources, how to compare competing truths, and so on, how to make sense of things, how to interpret works of art, how to interpret the news, how to interpret books and speeches. On the other hand, it may be that people who went to college and limited themselves to either vocational training in a narrow range of fields, or who never really partook of the liberal arts, may not be as well trained in evaluating sources of information. And, as we know, there's a great range of variety on the quality of the education you get, even in our finest institutions.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to test that empirical claim. My subjective experience is that people in the humanities don't necessarily have any particular advantage when it comes to philosophical thinking, and that I find people who have a background in maybe statistics and in the sciences are better capable of taking apart arguments and looking for testing their validity. That could just be an artifact of where I find myself, um, but maybe we should start by just digging into what exactly bad thinking is. I mean, I think your view of bad thinking is this notion that it's a notion of stubbornness, right? This idea that people
Right.
kind of dig in their heels and they ignore evidence, and it's more than just confirmation bias, which folks in the judgment decision making literature talk about, right? It seems like more. It seems like something that's in part temperamental rather than intellectual. Is this a temperament, or is this a way of thinking? Is it a disposition or a preference, or is it a way of thinking?
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think it's necessarily a conscious choice. It's not that people decided, well, I'm just going to stand by my beliefs no matter what. But it is, I think, a self-perpetuating cycle. In the book, we distinguish between two kinds of stubbornness, or two kinds of bad thinking. We call the first epistemic stubbornness and the second normative stubbornness. Epistemic stubbornness is where you adopt beliefs without sufficient evidence in favor of their truth. Now, there are many reasons why people adopt beliefs. For example, if a person believes in God, it may not be because they've seen evidence in favor of the truth of the belief, but because that belief brings them comfort. Um, so even though there may be reasons that explain why the person holds that belief, it doesn't make the belief rational. What makes the belief rational is that the belief is adopted because there is compelling evidence in favor of the truth of the belief, not just what it does for you, but that it's true. And moreover, that you don't hold on to that belief beyond the point where evidence counts against it. So if I have come to adopt a belief either because of very thin evidence or maybe because of no evidence, if I'm rational, when I start to see evidence that the belief is false, I will give it up. And to continue to hold on to a belief past the point where evidence shows that it's false, that's classic epistemic stubbornness. That's irrational. What we call normative stubbornness is it's more a matter of behavior, and maybe here temperament plays a bigger role. A person who is normatively stubborn applies rules without thinking. The actions they choose, the courses of behavior that they adopt, um, in these instances, what makes them stubborn is that they're going to do what they're going to do no matter what, perhaps because it's prescribed by a rule. So, for example, a police officer who pulls over a speeding car and then realizes that in the back seat there's a woman about to give birth. Will that police officer say, sorry, a rule's a rule and I'm going to ticket you? or will the police officer size up the situation properly and decide, okay, this is not here. An exception is warranted. The normatively stubborn person will go ahead with their behavior just because it's prescribed by a rule, without asking themselves, does the rule apply to the situation? Even if it does, is it appropriate to enforce the rule in the situation, and so on?
And so I think you point out that this type of stubbornness, it's not negatively correlated with intelligence. I mean, one would think that the more intelligent you are, the better you would be as a thinker.
You would think, but no, it's definitely not correlated with intelligence. I mean, perhaps there is a correlation, but intelligence is not a sufficient condition for good thinking. We know, we could name and point to a lot of very intelligent people who I think have displayed extremely irrational, even dangerous behavior. Mm-hmm. Some of them are in Congress. Some of them hold elected office. There's no guarantee just because you're smart, well-educated, and intelligent that you engage in good thinking. Now, I don't want to be cynical. Maybe some of these smart, intelligent people know that what they're saying or doing is wrong, but they're going to do it anyway because they see some practical benefit to be gained from it. Who knows what's motivating some of what's going on?
Well, what's the explanation for the persistence of bad thinking? I mean, there is a view which you articulate and which I think Spinoza shared, which is that it's really just in some ways a lack of knowledge, right? It's just an obliviousness to things as they are. I mean, what do you share that view? I mean, what is there? Is there a moral element? Is there a weakness of will that is to blame here? I mean, why is it that we see the pervasiveness of this, if it is in fact something which impairs our ability to experience true happiness?
I think it's a combination of all of these things. Certainly the absence of information will make it easier to adopt beliefs that aren't justified. If I don't have access to the evidence that would confirm or disconfirm a belief, I may go ahead and adopt that belief anyway for some reason or other. Maybe because people I admire are promoting the belief. Maybe I find the belief makes me feel better about myself or about the world. I think we'll leave it up to psychologists to determine why people adopt beliefs when it's not done on a strictly epistemic basis. But then, even in the face of information, it could be what you're calling a moral failure, weakness, what ancient philosophers called akrasia or incontinence, that they can't help themselves. Very often, we know what the right thing to do is, we know what is good, but we act contrary to our better judgment. That's not just something that's a matter of our actions and behavior, but even in our minds. Sometimes we know that a belief is not probably the right thing. It's probably not true. And yet somehow, through peer pressure, for example, we feel compelled to go with the crowd, and we find ourselves believing things that we have no evidence for believing, and in fact stand in the face of contrary evidence.
So, I mean, if you wanted to reduce the pervasiveness of bad thinking, what do you think we can do? I mean, you say that philosophy will help, but I mean, when you write a book like this, the people who are going to buy this book are going to be the people who
Right.
already are inclined, right? They
That's
don't
true.
want to do bad thinking, right? And so this is really maybe just sharpening their capacities a little bit by learning how to do inductive or deductive or abductive reasoning just a little bit better, maybe identifying some of the flaws in their logic. But by the time you pick up a book like this, you're already inclined to purge yourself of as much bad thinking as possible. So, I mean, how is there a way of making a bigger impact? I mean, how do you stimulate a desire among people to become more philosophical?
Well, it is true that the people perhaps most in need of reading this book are not likely to read it. But even those who I think are inclined to agree with us we do offer in this book, unless you've studied philosophy, we do try to offer in the book ways of dealing with friends or family members who are in the grips of irrational beliefs. So maybe you're a person who's inclined to be rational, you're intelligent, you're a good thinker, but that doesn't mean you have the skill for detecting bad thinking elsewhere. So first of all, there's a kind of forensic side to what we offer in the book. How can you discover bad thinking in others? And what steps can you take to, perhaps without losing friends or alienating family, to point out their bad thinking? But you're right, the deeper issue is how can people be, I don't want to say coerced, but educated to avoid bad thinking? Well, one way, I'm not sure how effective this would be, is, well, let them see the consequences of bad thinking. Look at January 6th. January 6th shows you what happens when bad thinking occurs on a large scale. And perhaps the shock of such events will stimulate people to come to terms with the misinformation, the bad faith that's being rampantly promoted. But even still, we need to go deeper. And in the book, we recommend philosophy, not necessarily as when you go to college, you should therefore take a philosophy course. But why not start educating young children as good citizens? In elementary school, we have them do math and we have them do science, and these are difficult disciplines. Philosophy, sure, I suppose it's a difficult discipline, but it can be made easy and accessible to children. Why are we not educating our youth in philosophy? Most of them don't study philosophy, if they study it at all, until they get to college. And I think the status of the humanities in our primary and secondary education leaves a lot to be desired. In English courses, you're probably not exposed to philosophical literature, to texts that challenge you not to be a good reader so much, but to be a good thinker. I think we need to revamp the humanities education. Are we exposing them to art history? Are we exposing them to philosophy? Are we teaching them logic in elementary and secondary school? Why not? These are important disciplines, just as important for citizenship as math and science.
Yeah, I mean, I remember taking a course in critical thinking. It was one of the first classes that I took when I started college at a young age. And it was in the philosophy department. But I think most people get exposed to these things in other areas, right? I mean, if you take geometry, for instance, then you learn about deductive reasoning, right? If you take other natural sciences courses, you become familiar with inductive reasoning, right? I mean, there are other areas, and nowadays I think in courses on statistics and data science, you're likely to get exposed to some of the kind of rules of inference and what constitutes a good or bad argument. Do you think that those things can be thought of as philosophy? I mean, is
No,
philosophy
no. I
is
mean,
philosophy? Yeah. And can people
so
learn
as you said,
philosophy in these different ways, or is a dedicated
no,
philosophy course the best way to
I don't
become
think
familiar
so.
with these?
I mean, as you put it, they're exposed to, they maybe become familiar with deductive or abductive reasoning, but that is not the focus of the lesson. And so, yes, if you're taking courses in mathematics or taking courses in physics or any of the natural and even social sciences, yes, you engage in that kind of reasoning. But the point of the exercise is not to become a good reasoner, but to basically acquire familiarity with the substantive content of the field. So yes, I think we should all be exposed to the scientific method. But philosophy goes beyond mere exposure because it's the method itself that becomes the focus of attention. There are a lot of
Yeah.
good scientists out there who are great at doing their science, but may not be so great at identifying fallacies in the reasoning of others.
And do you think we're better at identifying fallacies in the reasoning of others than in ourselves? I mean, I know that when I spend a lot of time with my politically liberal friends, they are really good at identifying bad thinking in these conservative folks. And when I hang out with conservative folks, they're really good at identifying the fallacies in the reasoning of the progressive folks. I mean, it seems like people are good at applying. I mean, they're fantastic philosophers, right? But in a targeted way.
It's always good to see the problem in somebody else and not to take a close look at the problem within yourself. And again, one of the other lessons of the book, and this is the lesson we get from Socrates, is how difficult self-criticism and self-reflection is. As Socrates puts it, the unexamined life is not worth living. And he doesn't mean the life of examining others, but the life of examining yourself. How are you living? Are your actions reflections of your values? But more importantly, you should reflect on those values themselves and see whether your beliefs about what justice is and what's good and what's bad are valid and justified beliefs. But yeah, it's always easier and much more comfortable to point out somebody else's faults than to look within yourself.
Now, I wanted to turn to your work on Spinoza. I love reading books like this, in part because it's kind of like doing a genealogical expedition to figure out where, I got a lot of these ideas. Right? So it's like, oh, okay, now I know, right? That's the Spinozistic part of my intellectual DNA. But I think, Spinoza is one of those philosophers that are perhaps more talked about than actually read in intellectual history circles, let's say. And yet Spinoza, I mean, he seems so foundational in so many ways. When you read his work, you recognize so much of a particular way of thinking about the world. And so I was wondering if you could sort of articulate, his vision of the homo liber, right? The free man, right? What does it mean
Right.
to be actually a free man? And how does that, I mean, the hardest part I have is trying to reconcile that with his deterministic view of who we are.
Well, it is true that Spinoza is more often mentioned than read, and in part it's because at least the Ethics, which is his philosophical masterpiece, is such a difficult work. It's written in the geometrical style with propositions and demonstrations, and it's not easygoing. At the same time, I think you're also right that so much of what we think of today as modern, secular, tolerant, even liberal, although I think that might be a misnomer when applied to Spinoza, comes from Spinoza and the more radical enlightenment to which he belongs. The free person is, for Spinoza, is the ideal human being. So most of us are beings who are enslaved to our passions. Human beings have both have a passionate side and a rational or intellectual side. And for most of us and most of our lives, we're governed by our passions, which is to say, we're governed by the way other things make us feel. We're responding or reacting to the world. So why do I pursue this? Well, because I think that would make me feel good. Why do I avoid that? Because I think that will make me feel bad. The person, though, who is guided by the intellect does what they do not because of how something will happen to make them feel, but because of what they know is good and what they know is right. So they won't pursue an object or perform an action because it causes in them feelings of pleasure, or avoid other things because of pain, but they will pursue an action or some object or end because they know it is in their own very best interest, truly in their own best interest to do so. So this person is free in the sense that they are autonomous, that their actions, their thoughts, their feelings are follow from their own nature, from what they are as knowledgeable beings who understand the world and understand themselves. Freedom, then, is really freedom from external influences. Now, nobody can be truly free from external influences because we have to live in the world. But you can liberate yourself insofar as your life is guided by reason and not by passion. Now, for Spinoza, the world is deterministic. Everything happens because of its antecedent causes. And this is as true as much for leaves falling off trees and rocks rolling down hills, and for our bodies, which respond to the physical influences of the world. But it's also completely true with respect to the human mind. Our mental states, our thoughts, our beliefs, our desires also exist within a deterministic system. So, for example, if I walk into an ice cream store and I order vanilla ice cream, I did that because I had a desire for vanilla ice cream. Well, then we could ask, well, why did I have a desire for vanilla ice cream? Well, because I have a belief that vanilla ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream. Well, why do I believe that? And so on. So we could trace back even my volitions, my acts of will, my desires and choices through antecedent deterministic causes. So Spinoza explicitly says there is no such thing as freedom of the will. If by freedom of the will you mean, I did this, but I could just as well have done that. All things being the same, I chose vanilla, but I could just as well have chosen chocolate. There is no such thing. But it doesn't mean that I cannot achieve freedom in Spinoza's sense, that is, that autonomy, that rational autonomy, which he also identifies as virtue and being more active and less passive. That's freedom for Spinoza.
So, I mean, he's got this descriptive part, and then he's got this prescriptive part. I mean, he's got this positive part, and I hesitate to say, but this normative part as well. And it's that move that I find somewhat difficult. But in the positive description, it reminds me a lot, actually, of the models that we have as economists for describing behavior, which gets to be tautological at some point, right? So you say, well, if you ate the ice cream, it's because you got utility from the ice cream. If you refrained from eating the ice cream because you're concerned about your long-term health, then that means that you got more utility out of your long-term health than your short-term pleasure. And to some degree, he seems to be saying that, right? In his descriptive model, there's this internal, what is it, conatus, right? And if that thing is strong enough, right, then people behave a certain way. And if it's not strong enough, then these outside influences impinge, and you get a different result. So how is that not, I guess, tautological? The sort of description of how the world works. I mean, it also seems very mechanical. It seems like an application of almost like a Cartesian mechanistic description of the world, where instead of being particles, right, you have these forces.
I'm not sure I would call it tautological, because what he does take himself to be doing is providing an informative and illuminating description of what we are and why we do what we do. Whereas a tautology would be he's just stating the obvious, and I don't think he takes himself to be doing that. But it is true that that side of the ethics, referring to the work, is descriptive. Part 3, for example, provides us with an analysis of the passions. What moves people? Why, in general, why do they typically do what they do? What is love? What is hate? What is envy and fear and hope and jealousy? Why do we pursue the things we do? Why do we avoid other things? And that does seem to be strictly descriptive. There is a normative side, though, as you mentioned, to all this. Although the problem is, how do you have normativity in a deterministic universe? If everything is determined, Spinoza can't really say, here's what you should do, because you're going to do what you're going to do given those antecedent causes. But I don't think Spinoza has normativity or needs normativity in that sense. What he is saying is, look, here's what a typical, an ordinary human life is like. It's a life governed by the passions. Here, and this is also in a sense descriptive, here is what a flourishing human life looks like. It's a life of freedom, rationality, and virtue. Why is that flourishing? Because it represents the peak of human power. You mentioned conatus. Conatus is that striving that constitutes every individual in nature. Each of us is a striving. And what we're striving for is to persevere, to maintain ourselves, but also to increase our power of striving so that we can continue, that we can do the things we want to do. And a flourishing human being is somebody who has achieved this peak of striving, who is more powerful. That's what the free person is. It's an image or representation of a more powerful, a more perfect human being. Now, because we are by nature striving to perfect ourselves, that's what we are. That's what we do. We can't help but strive to become more perfect. What Spinoza's doing is he's saying, well, this is what you are striving for, and here's how you can do it. Here's the means for becoming more rational. But again, it's not as if he thinks that all of a sudden I can decide in a libertarian way, oh, okay, I think I'll just change my life. In one of his earliest writings, he begins with some autobiographical paragraphs where he describes what it was like for him in his years as a young merchant. He had taken over his father's importing business after his father had died. And he says in these paragraphs that he was a businessman, a merchant in Amsterdam, but he found it to be a very unsatisfying life. He didn't feel fulfilled by the rewards of that life, and he thought the goods that he was pursuing in that life were transient goods, not really of the highest value. And that spurred him to wonder, are there greater values? Are there goods that are more persisting, that contribute in a more substantive way to my well-being? So notice that this move from the mercantile life to the philosophical life doesn't involve any kind of normative model where somebody says, here's the life you should lead. In a deterministic system, you become dissatisfied, and that moves you to seek a better life. And I think what the ethics is about, and Spinoza's philosophy about, is to reveal to its readers this difference between the life they're leading and the life they might lead, with the goal of inspiring them deterministically to seek out a more flourishing mode of existence.
Yeah, that story reminded me of, I guess, the Buddha in part, and also Saint Ignatius, right? There are these people that become disillusioned with a particular type of life. So would that mean then, and I think in the later part of the book you talk about this, does that mean that simply exposing people to this vision will induce potentially a striving in that direction? So if you are someone who is a philosophically inclined person, then part of what you do by circulating among the kind of less perfect people is you are perhaps inspiring them. But I mean, it seems like they may perceive you as being attempting to control them. I mean, I think that part of the explanation for what Spinoza talks about is people, they want others to think like them. They want others to be like them, right? And so,
Right.
so when you are going forth and talking about your enlightenment, so to speak, it is, and it will potentially be perceived as a kind of domination, right?
Elitist?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it seems like, you're lecturing to people. I mean, this is what I'm sure you experience this in your everyday life when you start talking to people. They accuse you of lecturing to them, perhaps.
Right. Especially my kids.
It's the curse of being an academic, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, Spinoza says that you will do this not because you won't even be doing it because you care about other people, right? You're not doing it because you are necessarily concerned with their well-being in some empathic way, but rather that this is just something that you do as part of your enlightened self-interest.
That's true, but it's no less valuable for that. So the way you've described it, I think, is absolutely right. And it's also why I think it's wrong to place Spinoza in the classical liberal tradition. Spinoza does not think that really the purpose of society is to allow each person to be free from external influence to pursue their own particular vision of the good life, kind of a Lockean vision, a liberal side. That is not Spinoza. Spinoza believes that what we do that the purpose of society is to encourage us to become more enlightened, more virtuous, more free, and more rational. Now, yes, it's elitist. That his task is to show other people that there is a true way of living, a better way of living, and that it is in their own best interest to pursue it. I don't see anything wrong with that, because look at what happens when we give up that project, when we stop trying to educate people to becoming to leading more rational, more epistemically and morally responsible lives. In fact, I think that should be part of our everyday education. The Spinozistic free person is deeply concerned about the well-being of others. You're right, it's for essentially self-interested reasons, and that's because the free person recognizes that they are better off living among other free people.
Mhm.
And it's very much like what Socrates says in Plato's dialogue, The Apology. Socrates, as you remember, was accused of corrupting his fellow citizens. And he responds to that charge by saying, do you think I'm an idiot? Why would I want to corrupt my fellow citizens? I have to live with these people. No, what I'm trying to do is to improve my fellow citizens, because what I want to live among other people who are virtuous. And Spinoza's free person sees the same thing, that it is in their own best interest to help others lead lives of rational virtue and freedom, so that they, in turn, will recognize that it's in their best interest to help me continue my life of rational freedom. And so I will do things that actively help other people improve their lives, improve them in a Spinozistic way by helping them to become more enlightened. Am I trying to impose a way of living on others? Yes, I am. And tough, because we're all better off. And yeah, it's elitist. But in the United States today, there's this what seems to me to be the curse of elitism, that the way to kill your chances for elected office is to come across as an elitist. I, for one, would rather have the President of the United States be somebody who is a member of an intellectual, educated elite. I don't want the president, or I don't want my representatives in Congress and my senators to be people who I would like to have a beer with, or who I think of as just regular old Joes or Janes. I want these people to be a kind of elite. I want them to know the law. I want them to be familiar with the Constitution. I want them to have philosophical reflections on justice, on equality, on all of the values that make our country, that inform the bedrock foundations of our country. I don't
But
see anything wrong with
um,
that.
well, I think making people aware of their lack of perfection, right? Um,
Yeah, you have to
could
be careful, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could work in two different ways. I mean, it could work to offer them some sense of hope and opportunity, or it could seriously disturb them. I mean, you recount the story from the Euthyphro, right, where someone is made aware that their firmly held beliefs have no foundation. Now, I think Euthyphro probably just moved on, didn't care, didn't pay a lot of attention. But if you,
Right.
come to that realization, it can be very disturbing. And I guess what a philosopher would say is, oh no, that happiness you have, that is not true happiness. True happiness is different, and it's not necessarily, it's very difficult to measure in some empirical way. So, from social scientists are always trying to, measure happiness, but philosophers, I think that they're saying in an almost unfalsifiable way that your subjective sensation of happiness is actually an illusion, is actually built on on poor foundations, right? So how do we how do we in a non-empirical way distinguish between what we think of as this happiness built on virtue and this type of happiness that is built on sand?
Well, this is where again philosophy comes in handy, because it all depends what you mean by happiness. Do you mean by happiness pleasure? Well, then happiness is just this passing thing that comes and goes. Do you mean by happiness a kind of ongoing satisfaction with your life? I think that's probably a better definition of happiness. The person will count themselves happy if they feel their life is going the way they want it to go. But that could also be a life that's not informed by any clear-cut values. So somebody, a Nazi might be very satisfied with their life. Would we want to say that the Nazi is therefore happy? So then you have philosophers calling for more robust and substantive conception of happiness. It's not simply being satisfied with your life, but being satisfied with a life where you are pursuing goals that you could defend as worth pursuing, defend in a rational way. I think the case of Socrates is a good one. He did go about pointing out to people that they weren't leading the most perfect lives. And look what happened to him. He got put to death. I think it's important that that one goes about this project with empathy, with consideration, with tact. You do it not by using the stick, but by using the carrot, and point out, and this is, I think, what Spinoza was doing, pointing out the benefits to be accrued by moving your life in the right direction. So, you're not going to go around insulting people saying, really, that's the life you're going to live? This is how sometimes when we're not in our best parenting mode, really, that's what you're going to wear, or you're going out with them. No, the better approach is to present them with alternatives, show the benefits of the alternatives, and perhaps get them to come along on a kind of voyage, an intellectual voyage with you.
Well, you point out that the unexamined life takes many forms. So you can have the unexamined life of someone who is doom scrolling all day on their phones, but there's also the unexamined life of someone like Achilles. And when you when you hear stories about that, I mean that it doesn't sound so bad. A life of heroics and adventure and so forth. Um, and then there are some examined lives that don't appear to be so wonderful or even moral or ethical. I mean, you talk about Clytemnestra, right? Who had very thoughtful reasons for doing what she did, right? She wasn't acting on autopilot, but she could justify and explain and articulate why she did what she did.
Well, yeah, Clytemnestra claims that she's acting out of justice, but I think part of the point of that trilogy is to get us to rethink the concept of justice. For her, justice is just revenge, an eye for an eye. By the third play in the trilogy, we're asked to accept a different conception of justice, one based on judgment, judgment that's informed by reasons and so on. Just because somebody is engaging in reasoning, it doesn't mean, and we could say maybe their reasoning is perfectly valid, that is, their conclusions follow from their premises, but it doesn't follow that the premises themselves are justified. And one could say that Clytemnestra's premises, including what constitutes justice, were faulty. As for Achilles, he's a very problematic character. The life he leads it's an unexamined life, and you say, well, it looks like a great life. Well, I'm not sure I would want to go around slaughtering people or at the risk of being slaughtered. And look at how the Iliad begins. Achilles is off brooding by himself because his girlfriend was taken away from him. And the consequences for this are tragic for himself. He loses his friend Patroclus. It's tragic for his colleagues. There's something heroic about Achilles. But again, we want to reflect on what really is a heroic life. Is it a life of violence, of selfish violence in pursuit of kleos and glory? Or can we reconfigure that into a different kind of heroism? Now, in the Apology, Socrates compares himself to the heroes at Troy, and he says it's exactly the same virtue at work. It's courage. And what he means by that is that I'm willing to put my life on the line for values that I believe are the most important values. In the case of the Homeric heroes, those values were glory, a bloody glory, and reputation and renown. Socrates says, well, that was their values. I'm putting my life on the line for better values, namely truth, wisdom, and justice.
Mm-hmm. We should probably maybe stop using these Greek examples because they're not well well known. Probably should talk about rap music, right? Which is
Well,
kind of
there's my point. They should
that's
be
the
well known,
Homeric
shouldn't they?
version of our day, right?
Yeah, but there again, there's the value of the humanities. These examples, whether we're talking about Greek literature or Chinese literature or African literature, it doesn't matter. The age of these tales, um, the fact that they represent older ways of thinking, some of them are valuable, some of them not so valuable. This is the point of a humanities education. And so we should, in an educated society, we should be able to refer to Achilles or Genji or any one of a number of classical works of art and literature.
Hmm. Now, I
Sorry,
mean, it seems like
that was just my natural reaction to what you said.
well, but I mean, I think that those values, I mean, they persist. They're not ancient values. I mean, we see them around us even today. As I said, you know, we listen to rap music. I mean, it is much of it is just channeling that kind of Homeric value system to some degree. Um, but
Yeah.
I guess one question I had for you is: it seems like Spinoza is channeling quite a bit of Stoicism, right? It's not quite the same, but there's quite a bit of it in his work. What does he take from Stoicism, and what does he leave from Stoicism?
So two things. You're right. He's absolutely influenced by Stoicism. In fact, there's so many influences on Spinoza. I think there's the Socratic influence. There's Stoicism. There's medieval Aristotelianism, especially through Jewish thinkers like Maimonides. There's Descartes and Cartesianism. There's Thomas Hobbes, political thinking. There's Dutch Republican thinking. The things he leaves behind in Stoicism are, first of all, this notion that nature is informed by kind of logos or rationality, that there's something providential about nature, that it's moving, that in a way nature does things for the best, and that we should follow nature. So for Spinoza, there are no values in nature. Nature just is, and whatever happens in nature happens necessarily by nature's laws. So he rejects the idea that there's any kind of rationale within nature. He also rejects the view that some Stoics have that the point of moral thinking is to rid ourselves of the passions and to live as dispassionate a life as possible. There are times in which Epictetus seems to be pointing us towards that kind of life. If you lose someone, if someone who you love dies, don't don't get overwhelmed with sadness because they were just there temporarily. They were borrowed. Um, Spinoza, I think, has a more realistic view of human nature. We are creatures of passion. You cannot be a living human being without passions. The point of his moral exercises is not to eliminate the passions or even to control them through acts of will, but to turn ourselves into the kind of people who can mitigate the effects of the passions while still feeling passions, not allowing them to guide you in your choices and your actions.
Hmm. Well, but he does also lean on this virtue of fortitude, right? I mean, that seems to play a huge role. This idea of overcoming weakness of will and you know, resisting these certain aspects of the passions that would influence us, right? I mean, does he get that directly from the Stoics?
It's hard to say what he gets from whom directly, but yeah, it's a very Stoic notion that we also find there, that there is a kind of meta virtue. He calls it fortitudo, or strength of character, which is basically our capacity to follow the guidance of reason as opposed to the guidance of the passions. And the other very Stoic element here derives from the determinism. Spinoza believes that once you are once you understand nature and how nature operates, and you see the necessity of all things, both the comings and goings of things you love and value or things you fear and hate, when you recognize that these things happen with the deterministic necessity of nature outside of your control, what you'll realize, and here's the other Stoic lesson, is that you shouldn't try to control them, but rather control what is under your control, namely your beliefs, attitudes, and judgments about them. Those things are a part of you, and thus, to some degree, under your control. And once you exercise that control, and you see the necessity of nature, you'll still feel emotions like love and sadness and pain and pleasure, but they won't be so strong. You won't be so overwrought at the loss of something you loved, or you won't be so overjoyed at the acquisition of something that you value, because you recognize that it's not under your control to lose or acquire them.
Mhm. Well, look, every culture has its virtues, whether they call them that or not, or whether they're explicit about it or not. But I mean, do you think that fortitude as a virtue is perhaps underemphasized in our contemporary world? Uh, I mean, it seems like the bad thinking that you describe in many ways is a symptom of a lack of a certain type of fortitude. And so, I mean, fortitude stands in opposition to stubbornness in a way. They sound similar, but
Right.
they seem to be right pushing in opposite directions.
As long as by fortitude you don't simply mean standing by your beliefs no matter what they
Hmm.
are, but
Hmm.
rather standing by reason and becoming the kind of person who does what they do because reason directs them to do it. Now, that in a way that just moves the problem back a step. Well, what do you mean by reason? Um, for a thinker like Spinoza, reason is not just some instrumental faculty we have for determining how to get from point A to point B. David Hume, for example, thought that reason's role in our lives is very limited. Reason won't tell you what you should pursue, but only how to get what it is you've chosen to
Hmm.
pursue. So reason doesn't give you substantive information about what's good or bad, but simply provides a map. It's a very practical discipline. For Spinoza, and I think for other thinkers like Descartes, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, reason doesn't just give you guidance on how to get what you want, it also tells you what you should want. And if by fortitude we mean standing by the dictates of reason and pursuing them steadfastly, not just in how to get what we want, but in allowing our rational side to determine what we want, what we should pursue, what's good and what's bad, then I think we could benefit greatly from it. Unfortunately, I think you'd be really hard pressed to find any discussion of fortitude or strength of character in political, moral, and cultural discussions today.
Well, I mean, when you raise children, right? I mean, I think it's fairly common to encourage them to, pursue their wants and certainly pursue their passions. Um,
Right.
I mean, is that in some ways bad advice?
Well, no, but it's just incomplete advice because you also want to make sure that their desires and passions are the right ones.
Hmm.
If I see, look at the parents who were recently convicted because their son went on a shooting rampage. Were they aware of what his passions were? I think it's the obligation of the parents not just to encourage our offspring to pursue their passions, but also to make sure that their passions are good passions and not destructive ones. And that's where the substantive part of parenting and moral education comes in, or make sure they're rational. I don't want them to pursue just any passion. I want them to pursue a passion that I think is a worthwhile and valuable passion, and that seeks to achieve good goals and not bad goals.
Now, you said in the book that Spinoza would endorse the notion of fake it till you make it to some degree, kind of like Pascal's wager, right?
Right.
If you, if for some reason you cannot summon up enough uh, internal volition to overcome these things, then you would just simply engage in the behavior that you see virtuous people and free people engaging in, and then this would somehow flow back and ultimately affect your your motivations. Um, I, I mean, I was fascinated by this. I mean, is this a? I mean, this seems to be uh, a psychology, right? This is a claim about how one can cultivate these internal capacities.
Yeah, but it's an old Aristotelian lesson. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics talks about how does one become virtuous. Well, you don't become virtuous simply because you want to be virtuous, although that's an important first step. Acquiring virtue is a matter of becoming habituated to acting and thinking and feeling in the right ways. But the first step to doing that, after you've decided you want to be virtuous, is to find yourself a virtuous person and act as they act. And in that early stage, what you're doing is so Kant made a distinction between acting in accordance with virtue versus acting from virtue. Acting in accordance with virtue means you're doing the actions that virtue requires, or in Kant's case, it was duty. You're doing the things that duty or virtue requires, but not necessarily doing them as a virtuous or dutiful person would. So in that stage, you're really imitating the behavior of a virtuous person. But over time, Aristotle believes, you become habituated to that mode of acting and feeling, and it becomes second nature, becomes your nature, and eventually you become a virtuous person. In a way, it's a point about as we say, it's an important point about the importance of role models in one's life as one grows up.
Right. So one should choose carefully who one spends time with, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Now, of course, Spinoza was famous for being accused of atheism, right? And depending on how you define it, I mean, it's a fairly accurate description. But he also, I mean, he seemed to have a great deal of respect for pious people. And he says, while religious people may be doing it for the wrong reasons, they often behave in ways that are similar to the ways that this free person would behave. I mean, it seems like he's almost like flipping the whole idea of the virtuous pagan upside down, right? Because within Christianity, there were these virtuous heathens who were behaving as if they were good Christians, even though they didn't believe in Jesus. And he's saying, well, there are these Christians who are behaving like free people, even though they, in spite of the fact that they have this religious view.
The most important thing for Spinoza is that you treat other human beings with justice and charity. That he calls the divine law, and he also defines it as piety. And yes, he has a great deal of respect for people who are truly pious, that is, people who treat other human beings with justice and charity, or, as I said earlier, help them become free, virtuous, and active individuals. Now, there's two paths to becoming a pious person. One path is philosophy. By studying the ethics, you get this idea of what that path is. You become educated about how it is, in fact, in your own best interest. First, you learn what virtue is. You learn what piety is. You learn what a good life is, what reason demands of us, and what the passions are. And then you, on that basis, you recognize philosophically that it's in your own best interest to treat other human beings in ways that they become virtuous. That is, you treat them with justice and charity. But most people aren't philosophically sophisticated enough to come to just and charitable behavior through philosophy. But there are other ways to be inspired or morally edified to being just and charitable. For example, Spinoza thinks that reading the Bible is a very good way to be inspired to just and charitable behavior, because the main message of the Bible, he seems to argue, is justice and charity. How he gets that message out of the Hebrew Bible, I'm not entirely sure, because we see a great deal of cruelty and evil behavior in the Hebrew Bible, including from the main character called God. But any work of literature, and for him, the Bible just is a work of human literature. For Spinoza, any work of human literature that inspires people to be just and charitable is therefore divine, in his sense of divine, because it makes us more pious. So if reading Shakespeare or reading Jane Austen inspires you towards just and charitable treatment of others, if it brings you to a better understanding of human nature, then those works or stories are divine. On the other hand, and this is what worried Spinoza to a great deal, preachers, priests, and rabbis who use the Bible in nefarious ways to increase their own power and control over others' lives, and encourages them to be superstitious and distrustful of others. When the Bible is used in that way, it is not divine, it's a wicked book. And so, yes, I think given his definition of piety, Spinoza believes that there is an important role for ordinary religion to play in society if it's done properly, and ordinary religion encourages in people obedience to the divine law.
So, look, if we wanted to reduce the amount of bad thinking, we wanted to increase the number of folks who are living the examined life, right, and make people more philosophical. I mean, what can we do? I mean, I think the likelihood of philosophy departments getting bigger budgets and more courses is probably pretty slim at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
how can we do it? I mean, I know some universities have had mandatory courses on rhetoric or critical thinking. I remember when I was at Duke, every incoming freshman had to take a class. We used to actually in our business school have a course for incoming MBA students on critical thinking, which didn't last very long. Um, is there a way that we could kind of push this further down earlier into education? Do we need to have like more AP philosophy classes, or is there a way to sort of just blend it into all of our teaching? Is there a way that we can expand humanities courses and maybe even into the science courses, spend more time reflecting on the methods that we're using rather than just simply using those methods?
Yeah, exactly as I said before, we need to be teaching philosophy and critical reasoning in elementary and secondary schools. We can certainly expand the philosophy curriculum, but if you can't bring the people to philosophy, you should bring the philosophy to people. And so if we're not going to be able, we'll try our best to increase enrollments in philosophy classes, and we'll try our best to increase philosophy being taught in the schools. But I think philosophers and those who are interested in good thinking need to be proactive, and we should have I think philosophers should be much more engaged as public intellectuals in bringing philosophy through the media. Community programs, lectures, reading groups, all of these are, I think, wonderful ways to bring philosophy to a broader public. And just as academic historians do a very nice job of writing popular books of history, and they sell well, I think philosophers can do a better job of writing popular books on philosophy. And we seem to be seeing a bit more of that. Philosophers have now taken up more seriously questions about virtue, about the meaning of life, about death and immortality. I think we need to see more philosophers writing for mainstream media. I remember after 9/11, when the New York Times wanted reflections on what has happened, they went to politicians, they went to journalists, they went to foreign affairs experts, and so on, even poets and fiction writers. But they didn't go to philosophers who might have had some very interesting insights to share on the meaningfulness of what happened on 9/11, and say, reflecting on recent events, what happened in Israel on October 7th.
So, do we need to give academic philosophers more professional credit for writing in a more accessible way? I mean, look, no one is going to be. We're not going to hand out the ethics to people in high school, and we're probably not going to hand out most of the publications by professional philosophers to high schoolers. Um, is is there are there professional pressures to stay away from that kind of communication, that kind of writing for
I
career
think there probably
reasons?
are, yes, early in one's career before one gets tenure, you need to prove your mettle and, write fairly technical articles for journals or very narrowly conceived books. But there's no reason why philosophers can't, like historians, do a very good job of writing for a popular audience. It shouldn't be that hard to do, and I think philosophers should be encouraged to do so.
Well, Stephen, thanks so much for joining me. The latest book is When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People. And, if I were still teaching my critical thinking class, I would definitely consider including this in the syllabus, because it really does a nice job of articulating some basics of not just logic, but also good thinking in the ethical domain. And then, of course, there is this book, Think Least of Death, right? So if you don't want to read the ethics, read this
There you
and
go.
some other books. Of course, we didn't even talk about Leibniz and his crew. Perhaps some other time. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.